It's another step in an escalating trade dispute between China and the West. The European Commission drastically increased import tariffs on Chinese electric cars. Chinese automakers would face duties as high as 38%, up from the current 10%. The bloc is reacting to China's widening its reach in global EV markets. Brands like BYD, Geely and SAIC have been expanding abroad, mostly due to their lower prices. Both the EU and the US are accusing Beijing of illegally subsidizing Chinese car manufacturers. The Commission says the tariff hike could be averted if talks with Beijing find a, quote, effective solution. The Chinese government accused the EU of protectionism.
The anti-subsidy investigation is a classic case of protectionism. It goes against the principles of market economy and international trade rules. It undermines China-EU economic and trade cooperation, as well as the stability of the global auto production and supply chain. It will ultimately harm Europe's own interests.
For more on this, I'm now joined by my colleague from the business desk, Lars Halter. Lars, what the Chinese government says there, will this really harm Europe's own interest, and in which way?
Yes, it might, of course, Gerhard. It might in the short and a long term. But this is not a new thing. We've seen this before. The Chinese might, of course, retaliate with their own counter tariffs. That's an old game. This tit for tat. One country starts enacting import tariffs against another country, that country responding in kind. And that is somewhat likely to happen here. Of course, we don't know what the Chinese would do in terms of these import tariffs they might strike us with. That could be on cars as well. That would be staying in the auto sector. That could be devastating, definitely, for some of the German brands, Mercedes or Volkswagen, because they have already lost market share in China over the last couple of years, and making their cars expensive by way of import tariffs, of course, would hurt them even more. Same is true, of course, for Italian cars or French cars. China might also not stick within that auto sector, go into other consumer goods. Over the past couple of years, we've seen counter tariffs imposed on Italian cheese or Irish whiskey or French cognac or so.
Now, what's then behind this EU's decision? Is it about the subsidies, really about the subsidies that the Chinese give to their automakers?
Yes, it is definitely. And that's also not new, really. China has always done that. They've always heavily subsidized their industry, because export is a huge part of their economic strategy. It's really hard, however, to find real numbers. I looked at a couple of studies here, and one study said that the Chinese government, just in the auto sector over the last 5 years, also spent about almost $60 billion. Another study looked at the time from 2009 to 2022, and they were talking about $170 billion. So we're really seeing massive subsidies there for sure. It's really hard to get those numbers reliably, because there's just so many ways how Beijing subsidizes these companies. It's not really just as easy as wiring money from government accounts to a corporate account. It is much more like they give certain companies access to batteries or raw materials at really, really cheap under market prices, or they could give them preferential lending or so. There's many ways really to subsidize an industry.
This whole problem of subsidies, is that confined to the auto sector, or is this a bigger problem altogether?
It is definitely a bigger problem, much bigger than that. Autos might right now be the most pressing problems we're seeing, but we've seen it over the last couple of years with solar panels or with wind turbines. And of course, over the last couple of decades, we've always seen how China has flooded global markets with cheap products. Often they were in subsidized industries, of course. And as I mentioned briefly before, this is really part of China's strategy, and it's becoming stronger again, because China has a problem. China still has very low consumer spending. It has historically gone up, and by the end of last decade, it almost turned China into a consumer economy. But then came COVID and an economic crisis, and now the Chinese consumer is relatively weak again, and that, of course, makes strong exports more important for the country.
Lars Halter, BW Business. Thank you very much, Lars.
Welcome.